Alright, the year is over. Listicles have been compiled and forgotten, upcoming release lists have been edited to replace 7s with 8s, and so many things went wrong it's easy to lose track of what went right. And that's not because gamers are entitled or more prone to overreaction than other hobbyists, as AAA publishers and business analysts like to whine when they need an excuse to bump their self-image back up to omnipotent demigod. No. That's because there was a truly epic mountain of rushed releases, broken ports, obnoxiously Orwellian PR bullshit, and game-breaking monetization strategies to annoy us this year. I freely admit to being easily annoyed. It comes with age, I think, but even the most relaxed gamer has to admit that this was a turning point year in the hobby. With all that said, several games I played this year did more than anything else to really point out just how full of shit the biggest corporate developers are, and to provide important lessons that could teach those companies how to keep and please their customers, but will, ultimately of course, be forgotten almost immediately. If you like what I have to say, or how I sound saying it, do me and you a favor, and please click the like, comment, subscribe thing, all that. As always, let's really quickly get a brief history of the AAA publishers' failures this year before moving on to the 4 games and how they proved that publishers were either incompetent, full of shit, or more likely, both. Activision Blizzard. Activision Blizzard. Maybe they should change the name to Blizzard Activision. That way when people who play games had to say it out loud, it would go Blizzard Activision instead of Activision Blizzard? Now that's not to say that Blizzard doesn't need to answer for their own shitty practices, like using a team of sleazy corporate lawyers to figure out a loophole to circumvent Chinese law, rather than simply tell their customers what the odds associated with their loot boxes were. Or basically popularizing the microtransaction and premium game system with their very early sales of mounts and WoW. But Blizzard's ability to craft unique and beloved gameplay experiences, and their ability to communicate with their players without sounding like soulless corporate husks, has insulated them from much of the fury that Activision engenders when they engage in the same practices. This year, Activision has dealt with crisis after crisis in Destiny 2, including a suddenly extreme and in-your-face microtransaction system that's getting as much, if not more content put into it than the base experience of a game that is quite literally built around getting loot. A post-DLC controversy that is the exact same controversy Destiny 1 had, a controversy stemming from Destiny lying to its players' faces by hiding how much XP was actually being earned, and honestly, just Destiny 2 being a huge pile of meh. Outside of Destiny, Activision was caught filing a patent for a grotesquely manipulative system whereby players would be match-made based upon their microtransaction purchase history. Remember that? This was the one where players would be put into matches where they'd succeed after making a purchase to reinforce that behavior, and be put up against better players who had bought MTXs to encourage purchases. Oh yeah, they also used Normandy Beach as a social hub in Call of Duty, a place it forced players to have to visit so they'd be compelled to watch other players opening loot boxes. And oh yeah, the Call of Duty Modern Warfare remastered shit was actually going on early last year. Jesus, Activision. By the way, I've become convinced that the move away from direct loot drops and to the token system in Destiny 2 was a way to subtly get players used to the idea of no longer getting gear in the game. You can't tell me anyone thought it was more fun to beat a raid and have to wait through 2 loading screens and a jog to get the suddenly underwhelming raid gear than to immediately get it from a boss kill. Activision's year shows they've been exploring ways to subtly manipulate player behavior, and writing this, it kinda suddenly makes perfect sense. Warner Brothers. I'm not going to get into the controversies about Warner Brothers paying YouTube influencers for positive reviews, because that was last year and they had more than enough go sideways this year. Quick aside, I really hate the term YouTube influencer. It makes my skin crawl. Not content to publish a guaranteed to be successful massive sequel to a previously successful game, Warner Brothers had to stuff it full of microtransactions. And not content, of course, to just sell people products, they had to sell the possibility of getting digital products. Of course, the odds of getting any particular product was hidden from the consumer, and this system was so shitty, the lead developers themselves said they wouldn't be buying them. When the person you send out in interviews to defend a shitty system can only say they exist for player choice, but that they themselves won't buy them, you know it's a garbage system. Getting the true ending of the game, of this single-player game, was of course proved to be a nearly endless grindy mess, clearly balanced around compelling completionists and whales to dump money into a gambling system in the hopes they would get the orcs they need to finish. Oh yeah, they also announced that in tribute to the death of a beloved member of the team at Monolith, they had made a character called Forthog the Orc Slayer who would be available for download on day one for $5. Sometimes, I like to envision conference rooms where dozens of suits sit discussing decisions that are so amazingly bad, so obvious to be a disaster, and wonder how many people looked down at their laps and thought, well, this'll be a shitstorm. And don't tell me about how WB said they wouldn't get any profit from these sales. I'm not sure why I would believe them unless they're willing to open the books, and either way, it's just ridiculously tone deaf to have a microtransaction memorial as you're dealing with a microtransaction scandal in your big game. Bethesda and Take-Two Interactive. On to the mid-size guys. Bethesda spent the year shooting themselves in the foot by continuing an absolutely ridiculous and self-defeating policy of not allowing reviewers to get advanced copies of their games. Now, this is not an issue with games like Fallout, because they could release Fallout 4 New Orleans tomorrow unannounced and it'd sell a bazillion copies. But this year Bethesda released a game that was a completely new IP, that strangely still bore the title of a game it had nothing to do with, from a studio who's known for smaller release stealth-based games that had a really terrible beta and actually stacks its worst, shittiest 6 hours of gameplay right up front. So Bethesda quite literally killed its own game with a policy that serves absolutely no purpose. What's worse is, they stuck by the corporate doublespeak reason for the policy. See, Bethesda wasn't limiting access to reviewers to try and insulate itself from mediocre reviews, no. Bethesda just wanted to make sure that everyone could experience the game together. It's a total crock of shit, and if you believe that, I don't know what to tell you other than to let you know that you're entitled to a huge inheritance from a long-lost relative, and if you'll just forward me your routing and checking account numbers, I'll get it to you as soon as possible. It is totally on the up and up. Oh yeah, they tried the fucking paid mods thing, again. Take-Two continued literally drowning in the money from overpriced shark cards, said they'd be putting microtransactions into every game possible going forward, then shut off all mod support for GTA 5. They also still won't fucking let me get screenshots or game captures for any of the original BioShock games, the remaster, or for Borderlands 2. And finally, OEA. Listen, I only have so much time before my readers have their eyes glaze over, and while I normally push that as far as I possibly can, I'm discussing EA here, so I have a moral duty to consider the needs of those with medical conditions that cause nausea. As such, we're going to keep this section short and sweet before moving on to the good news. EA. EA was involved in the conceptualization, design, creation, testing, beta, and launch of Star Wars Battlefront 2. That whole time, EA didn't see a problem. Just days before launch, they didn't see a problem. EA then sent corporate shills out into the world to explain to people just how stupid they were for being mad and not realizing that the ridiculous, terrible RNG progression system, the endless grinding, the selling of gameplay advantages in a casual-focused multiplayer shooter, and the loot boxes weren't there for EA's benefit. They were there for the player's benefit. You know, for choice and time and accomplishment and stuff. Then they went on Reddit to slowly repeat themselves, and got testy when players pointed out the bullshit. Then they patted themselves on the back for listening, then said they wouldn't be changing their strategy, then they changed the strategy and gave themselves an applause for removing the boxes. Then they explained they'd be coming back, then said that the removal somehow wouldn't hurt the game's bottom line, which, incidentally, completely undermines the argument for why this piece of shit system had to be in the game in the first place. They also said that they couldn't possibly have kept their loot boxes cosmetic because of lore and shit. This despite previous games having had cosmetic options, and the Star Wars universe having a tremendous cache of lore to choose from. And then it was quickly found that there were already cosmetic options in the game waiting to be turned on at a later date. EA also did their usual shuttering of studios, shat on its own obscenely expensive Star Wars license by canceling a game certain to be a hit because it was, quote, shaping up to be a linear single-player experience, unquote. Alright, this piece isn't and never really was meant to be about any of those particular controversies. What it is about is showing how several of the most successful games this year demonstrated that almost everything the big publishers say about how they must do business is bullshit. Let's keep this positive by organizing it by the games that succeeded and what they teach us. NieR Automata is the anti-Assassin's Creed. My last piece was about NieR Automata, a fantastic game with great combat, an amazing story, and some of the best music I have ever heard in a game. If you haven't played it and like me were a bit skeptical, you're doing yourself a disservice. NieR Automata put the lie to one of the AAA publishers' biggest whines. That games are so expensive to make they must be packed full of microtransactions, because how else would Ubisoft make a profit? Well, in my NieR analysis I spent a good deal of time pointing out all of NieR's flaws, which were obvious ways to keep the production cost of the game low. Most NPC dialogue is text-based, as opposed to AC Origins, where basically every NPC has voice dialogue. NieR's map is fairly small by modern standards, as opposed to AC Origins, which has just the most ridiculously unnecessarily huge map ever. There's pop-in and low-resolution textures, as opposed to AC Origins, which features almost lifelike fidelity and the best rendering of water physics I have ever seen. But NieR shows that all those things developers like Ubisoft claim they have to do, it's all bullshit. It was Ubisoft, not players, who decided they needed lifelike water and a map so large my eyes glaze over thinking about it, and NPCs who have voice actors but nothing interesting to say. Ubisoft and the other huge developers decided they have to have these things, not because they make the game experience all that much better for the player, but because they make marketing and PR easier for Ubisoft. Sending someone out to do interviews with a postcard telling them to stress the largest map ever in a game, true 4K resolution, thousands of lines of voice dialogue, that's easy. The big publishers have allowed marketing to interfere with design. NieR took the Assassin's Creed open world formula and distilled it to include only the most important things that the player would actually care about. It's one of the best games of the generation, made by a studio in financial trouble, reportedly on a shoestring budget, and they showed, once again, that a great game doesn't need to cost so much to make that it needs to cut corners on music and stability and cram it full of gambling mechanics to make a profit. It sold over 2 million copies with a very modest marketing push behind it. Oh, and it had absolutely zero microtransactions at all. Not one. Horizon Zero Dawn and the death of new single-player games. AAA publishers have a habit of deciding what they would like to happen is what has already happened. For years, we've heard from these companies about the games as service model, and how every game has to have a crammed-in multiplayer mode or be multiplayer-only title, because players just don't want single-player games anymore. EA and Activision and the rest, they're not foregoing interesting new ideas and pumping out Call of Duty and Battlefield and Madden and FIFA as often as is humanly possible because those games can be developed quickly and easily and be crammed full of microtransactions. No, they're doing that because they've listened to gamers and players just don't want to engage with single-player games anymore. And listen, games as service are an important and for me very fun area of gaming. I still play Overwatch consistently because my 11-year-old daughter is a mega fan of the Overwatch universe. I played World of Warcraft from vanilla through Warlords of Draenor. I spent 1,500 plus hours with Destiny 1, and I'm currently in the process of getting my kids into Warframe because Destiny ruined itself. But the idea that good single-player games are being released less often by the big studios because players don't want them is just absurd. I haven't bought a Switch yet, so I can't use Mario and Zelda to make my point, but I did play a game that shows EA is full of shit. My tastes run to pop. Even though I'm a former hardcore kid and current indie rocker, I like pop indie rock. And even in video games, I generally like easily accessible stuff. I'm not into JRPGs, I find adventure games and most walking simulators boring. So in general, I am the average normal EA customer. And despite EA insisting that I don't want single-player games, my favorite game of the year was Horizon Zero Dawn. And apparently I'm not alone because the game is on track to sell 8 million units in its lifespan. Horizon Zero Dawn breaks no new ground. It's a very standard open-world game. It manages to be nearly perfect because it isn't bloated and tired, and its story and combat are refined and polished enough to be near perfect. It also has the best total package of visuals of any console game to date. Almost everyone who played this game loved it. And you know what? It's a single-player game. It doesn't even feature a tacked-on multiplayer option. It's just a perfectly balanced, wonderfully produced, fun, single-player game that was a huge hit and has a sequel on the way. So how is it that this AAA single-player game managed to be a critical and commercial success when we spent the last 3 years hearing these types of games are dead because no one wants them and they cost too much to be profitable? Well, it had a production budget of only $47 million, with most of the development having a team of only 20 and at its peak 200. And on top of that, it's a new IP. The big developers spent the previous generation furiously spending tens of millions of dollars ripping each other off with crappy clones in search of a hit. This strategy predictably failed, and the lesson the publishers took from that wasn't, hey, we need to stop making shitty clones of other games that got here first. No, the lesson they took was, gamers don't want new IPs or single-player games. It must have seemed truly wonderful that the lessons of the last generation reinforced ideas that make their jobs easier and entail less risk. Unfortunately for them, they were deluding themselves. Gamers don't want anything in particular. They don't want great graphics, they don't want huge maps, they don't want single-player games, multiplayer games, always online games, they just want great new games. Horizon Zero Dawn is one of the best games of the year at an almost bargain cost for a AAA open world game because it was a game that Guerrilla wanted to make. It was a game with a vision, and it made the best game it possibly could around that vision, without all the bloat, without focus groups shaping the design, without a tacked-on multiplayer or a baked-in loot box system for sale. EA shut Visceral down this year. Visceral, a studio they had basically ruined by murdering Dead Space 3 with a microtransaction progression system. EA's stated reason for shuttering the studio and killing its own new Star Wars game is that the game was shaping up to be a linear, single-player experience, and players no longer want games like that. EA claims they've been carefully monitoring the marketplace, and the conclusion they've drawn is that what would be best for EA is actually what players want. I guess they missed that the vast majority of this generation's best games were single-player games, and that Horizon Zero Dawn was a completely single-player, big-budget, massive hit. EA is full of shit. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Unfortunately for EA, the largest multiplayer hit of the year was not Star Wars Battlefront 2. EA spent a tremendous amount of money on the Star Wars license, comfortable in the knowledge that it would be almost impossible to not make boatloads of dough off of 10 years of Star Wars games at a time when the film franchise has been revitalized. EA sold 14 million copies of their first, hugely disappointing, barely half of a game Star Wars Battlefront 1. 14 million copies. Even if none of those were Super Vader Diamond Gold All-Universe editions, and of course a shitload of them were, that would have been $840 million in revenue before one piece of overpriced garbage DLC map pack had been sold. That's a pretty good amount of money for a game that wasn't very good. But EA said they heard the fans and promised to make Star Wars Battlefront 2 the game that players had been expecting. With no paid DLC, a single-player campaign, and space battles, it stood to reason that Star Wars Battlefront 2 would be the biggest story in multiplayer gaming in 2017. Actually, come to think of it, I guess it really was the biggest story of 2017. It stood to reason it would be the biggest positive multiplayer story in 2017. Nope. That title goes to a game that was made on a tiny budget, basically by a single dude, using mods of Arma 3. PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds even has a name that could literally be a case study in a first semester marketing class about how to not name your product. But PUBG is the biggest multiplayer hit of the year, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 is such a disaster, EA doesn't have an easy way to fix it. Once again, this comes down to the myth that games are so damn expensive to make that players need to either pay $120 for a complete game, like Star Wars Battlefront 1, or pay infinite bucks for the complete game, like Star Wars Battlefront 2, or they just can't afford to make games. But PUBG proves that good games don't come purely from the profit motive. Yes, nobody would make games if they couldn't get paid for their efforts, but games are a form of art, and all good art comes first from the creative impulse. PUBG was made on a shoestring budget from existing assets. Its graphics are pretty good on PC and adequate on Xbox. Its gunplay is solid, if unspectacular. Its map is good, but nothing groundbreaking or special. What PUBG proves is that the way to make a hit game isn't to make a list of what other hit games have done and meticulously check off boxes until you've got every one. It's to ask, what is a new and interesting and fun way to play? Even if PUBG's gameplay isn't quite as revolutionary as what Bluehole says, it's got a great hook, a low skill floor, a high skill ceiling, and a gameplay loop that is wonderfully refined because the game was crafted first to be fun and then to be profitable. It even leaves open the door for mountains of cosmetic microtransactions, hopefully for direct purchase, but even if loot boxes are permanently instituted, the game was not designed around them. Star Wars Battlefront 2 had a core gameplay loop, literally and obnoxiously, and so very obviously crafted around the microtransaction system. The entire progression system isn't run through loot boxes because that's fun. It's run through the system because if players had stood for it, it would have been a system that finally fused gameplay and loot boxes completely. EA wants you to believe that the loot boxes are totally necessary because big, persistent games-as-service games are so expensive to make, they're just taking a beating on everything they put out, unless they can cram it full of every single monetization strategy they can think of. PUBG proved they were full of shit in 2017. Warframe. You might not realize this, but EA, Activision Blizzard, Take-Two, WB, and all of their buddies think you're an idiot. They think you're too stupid to realize that you're getting half the game you used to. They think you're so stupid you'll believe the big publishers are hemorrhaging money. They think you'll believe that loot boxes are an absolute must and that they simply couldn't afford to release a full game or make a few maps without them, despite the fact that game after game does just that. And worst of all, they think you're too stupid to handle things like, a decent story and a deep progression system. You'll often hear the bro gamer types lamenting the casuals ruining gaming, but it isn't the casuals ruining anything. People like what they like and they have the time they have. What's ruining games is that big companies quite literally think casual players are idiots who will refuse to engage with a game. They think people who don't play 6 hours a day will look at a progression tree and say, holy shit, what am I doing my taxes here? Nah, fuck that, give me Candy Crush. No game better demonstrated the lack of respect that big developers have for their players this year than Destiny 2. A game that served as a sequel to an extremely simple RPG Lite and literally removed even the very basic RPG elements because somebody decided the reason Destiny reviewed badly wasn't because it was empty, shallow, vacuous, and lacked content, but because it was just too damn complex for the morons to handle. Here's a quick checklist of the changes Destiny 2 made in an effort to make the game simpler. And that's just off the top of my head. But there was another loot grind space opera multiplayer PvE focused game that continued its shocking rise to success this year. Let me begin by saying I've only just started playing Warframe in the last couple of weeks. It's been installed on my Xbox and my PC for a couple of months, but during that time I still had hope that Bungie would reveal that Destiny 2 had actually been an elaborate ruse designed to make people realize just how good Destiny 1 was. Alas, the Curse of Osiris ended my time with Destiny 2, and I finally began to seriously consider Warframe. Now, if Warframe had the budget and smooth gameplay of Destiny, it would be nearly perfect. But after about 10-12 hours with the game, I can see what it is. A very good free-to-play game that has defied the odds to be a success. How does a game that literally no AAA publisher wanted anything to do with end up with 36 million registered users and a peak PC player count of 121,000? By not condescending to their players and crafting a deep, highly customizable RPG shooter. Warframe has consistently and repeatedly refined and added to the game and taken player feedback to heart. It has a huge variety of classes that change the way you play the game, and then further differentiates itself with weapons and mods and cosmetic customization. The game is loaded with content, with more coming all the time, and as for the microtransactions, if you would like a Warframe or mod slots or a weapon, you trade money for that item. Then you receive that item. You don't receive a hidden percentage chance of getting the item, you get the item you want. Warframe was developed with all of Digital Extreme's money and self-published. Then the game was given to players completely for free, with consistent and often quite large content updates all being free, and it's been a huge commercial success for Digital Extreme, because they respected their players' intelligence and ability to engage with the game with depth, and trusted that if they made cool shit and offered to sell it to players at a fair price, players would reward them. I'm not suggesting Destiny needs to be as impenetrable as Warframe. In fact, that would be a pretty obvious mistake. But I am saying that Warframe proves that if you want players to stick around for months in a row, you need to respect their intelligence. There needs to be a decently high level of complexity and customization, so players feel like they are always working towards something. Destiny doesn't need 50 classes and thousands of mod combinations to be a successful game, but it needs to respect its audience's intelligence enough to give them systems with enough depth to not feel like once you've played for 10 hours, you've seen everything the game does. Warframe proves that the developers were completely wrong when they decided that a rich, complex, customizable progression system just can't be successful. It also proves that when you hear Activision or EA or WB say there's no way they can be profitable without adding loot boxes to their $60 to $120 game, they are just full of shit. You could also just Google their stock prices. In conclusion, It was real easy to spend 2017 constantly vacillating between being amused at the huge publishers' incompetence and self-defeating practices, and being furious as games that would have been hugely successful and profitable were ruined by focusing on monetization before making a fun game. Any successful company needs to focus first on making products consumers want, and then worry about how best to sell it. But the biggest publishers have got it all backwards. If EA continues releasing unfun games with odious monetization strategies, if Activision keeps condescending to its players, if Warner Bros. Keeps meddling in the development process, these companies can fail. There was a time when nobody could have imagined anyone but IBM would be the biggest computer company in the world. Then Microsoft and Apple ate their lunch by making products that consumers wanted. Here's to hoping that PUBG, NieR, Horizon Zero Dawn, Zelda, Mario, Warframe, all the other great games of the year finally show the big publishers the error of their ways. Or at least that one of the big publishers starts to take notice of what games actually succeeded and why. Because what's good for the player is what's good for EA, not the other way around. And the sooner they learn, the better off we'll all be. Alright. It would be positively glorious if you'd watch my other videos. And if you watch those videos, I'd be ever so pleased if you liked, shared, and subscribed. And if you do all that, I'd be most gratified if you were to join us in the garden for tea this afternoon. Oh, it shall be most delightful indeed. Bye.